Greetings, my friends. Do you have a perception that women from bygone decades all sat around the home, cooking, cleaning, and letting the men have all the fun? On this Season 2 opening episode, we are going to challenge that notion. Join me and my guest, Janet Newman, as we talk about Clara and her 3 years of world travels in the 1930s. Welcome to Jackie Just Chatters. By sharing people's stories, I strive to generate laughter, inspiration, maybe help you escape from the stressful world. I am your hostess, Jackie Lentz, who's still figuring out her own story. This podcast comes out every other Thursday. I can be found wherever you get your podcast or on YouTube. I'd be most grateful if you left me some stars or a review, and subscribe if you never want to miss an episode. Thank you for listening and sharing. This is a thrill for me. I am chatting with Janet Newman, who I can personally say is an intelligent, generous, and fun woman. She is also the author of an inspirational nonfiction book, Letters from Clara, One Intrepid Woman's Travel on the Eve of War, from 1936 to 1939. Welcome to the show, Janet.
Well, Jackie, thank you so much. It's so nice of you to have me on your podcast. I remember that you mentioned my book early on, just as it was about to be launched. You mentioned it on your podcast, and that meant a lot to me. And I know that Clara has. I know that you really like that whole time period. You're really somebody who appreciates these vintage scenes, and I think that that's partly why you were interested in Clara. But you're right. It's been she's an inspiration, and I'm just delighted to have an opportunity to speak with you about her.
I'm so grateful I saw the news article about your book coming out, and it just right away, right from the title, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is right up my alley. And I'm going to take a moment right now, and I just need to
Go
crush on your
ahead.
book for a moment. As a former social studies teacher, one of the things I discovered very quickly was how much women's voices are missing in history. It is such a tale of elite white males. They dominate the history textbooks that my students would read, even what I was studying when I was at university. And I love how your book dives into this extraordinary life of a woman, but also that she's a woman who came from a completely unprivileged background. Clara is a common woman who did amazing things with her life, but it's not like she was so amazing that she became this celebrity so everybody knew about her. No, she was just really an average person who did exceptional things, and time easily could have forgotten. And this kind of voice is so missing in historical literature, and I'm just so happy it's out there.
Well, when I found her letters, I really felt like I wanted to share them with others. I did not want to keep them to myself because Clara did have such a clear voice. Something I've come to appreciate about her is that she was really the author of her own story. She did lead a very purposeful life. You're right. Did not have she did not have a lot of advantages growing up, but she figured out how to pursue the life that she saw for herself, and not only to pursue that, but to record it. Her intent always was to have her letters published. She wanted them bound and shared. To my knowledge, she wasn't able to get that done, but I was able to do that for her, and that just made me feel so pleased. She was a woman of well, actually, in the words of that time period, a woman of daring do. And she still, I mean, she's very inspiring for all of us many decades later.
There were so many times during the book I felt like if Clara could do this, then really anyone could. You know, she does this exceptional thing. Within all of us, we can achieve exceptional things, and I would just even connect to her character even more. Did you find the same kind of thing when you were reading her letters? Like, did you just feel inspired to be like, "I've gotta go and do great things"?
Well, I definitely felt a connection to her, but I certainly am not as adventurous as she was. But my adventure, I guess, was actually, getting her letters published. I sort of viewed that as my adventure and my journey. Since the book has been published, though, there was something that almost eerily made me feel connected to Clara. It wasn't until the book was about to be launched that the Historical Society in the county where Clara lived contacted me and said that they had just cataloged a scrapbook that Clara had kept during the first 5 months of her trip around the world. Up until this time,
Oh,
yeah, isn't that so? Does that give you goosebumps? And
it does. I wanna see this.
so what had happened is that someone had bought a box of miscellaneous items at an auction. When the person then was downsizing and about to move, just decided to donate this scrapbook. And then it was sitting there at the Historical Society for a while before they got it cataloged. So I have now had the opportunity to look in that scrapbook, and there is a lot in there I could talk about. But the one thing in particular I want to talk about, which made me feel so connected to Clara, she pasted in the back cover of the scrapbook a newspaper clipping from a going away party that had been given for her just before her departure on this trip. And in the clipping, it describes that she wore a white dress, which I think was a very deliberate choice. Suffragists wore white. And it also said, the newspaper clipping also indicated that she had been given a corsage of gardenias. Now, if you remember, the first three words in my book are the scent of gardenia. When I began my job as the executive director of the YWCA of Wausau, Wisconsin, I was given a gardenia corsage at a welcome reception. So the idea that it was the scent of gardenia that launched Clara's trip, just like it was the scent of gardenia that launched my career at the YWCA, just is a thrill for me.
That's awesome. Well, and as you were talking about with your writing, the book really is kind of 2 stories at once. You know, there's the story of Clara and her travel and how it impacted her, but also about your journey of learning about her and getting the book published. If you could give an abbreviated version of how this book happened to you. Obviously, I know about it, but, my listeners don't. So if you could tell them how did this happen?
Sure. Well, it was 30 years ago that I began working at the YWCA of Wausau. And in my office, there was a file folder of letters. The label on the file folder was Letters from Clara, but nobody knew who Clara was or why those letters were at the YWCA. And now, of course, this was 1993, so that was before Google. It was not easy to find information about Clara, but my local historical society did refer me to a man named Bud Morgan, who they said his aunt had been a very dear friend of Clara's. So I met Bud Morgan, He was a young boy when Clara set off on her trip around the world, but he told me fun stories about her. And in his attic, he had the typewriter that had accompanied Clara on her trip around the world.
Oh,
And he gave me that typewriter, and I still have it, although I'm going to, of course, donate it to the Historical Society once my book promotion is finished. In those days, I had a newspaper column, and one month I had written about my discovery of these letters. And after that, I got a phone call from a woman whose elderly father was living with her in Minnesota, and he and his wife had been friends of Clara's, and he was willing to talk with me. So one weekend I traveled to meet him, and he is the one who gave me the photograph of Clara on a camel in front of the pyramids. And that is the picture that is on the cover of the book. It wasn't until my retirement that I, told myself, look, you have always had this desire to put these letters into a collection and share them with others. This is the time to do it. So I did. I joined a writer's circle, and I returned to the YWCA of Wausau. When I had left employment there, I had put all of Clara's letters and the typewriter and any photographs that I'd been given, put them all in the safe. So I went back to retrieve them, only to discover that the safe was no longer in use. And so I had to try to find a safe cracker to get access to these documents again, which I did.
at least they were kept safe.
Yes. Well, you think about, first of all, isn't it just astonishing that these letters had been sitting in my file folder all those years and nobody had, discarded them? That was wonderful. By this time, of course, research was a little easier. And so I was able to learn a lot more about her. Also, from her obituary, of course, I was able to learn sort of the skeleton of what she did with her life after she concluded this trip around the world. But basically, what I came to understand is that Clara was 40 years old. Clara had remained at home after high school to care for her mother. And it wasn't until her mother died that Clara felt that she could pursue her dream. That happened to be when Clara was 40 years old. I am convinced that she knew that she could, the reason she thought she could undertake this trip around the world was that she knew wherever she went in the world, there would be a YWCA that could help her find a place to live and find a job. Clara was one of the first members of the YWCA of Wausau. It opened in 1920, which of course was a significant year. Women's suffrage had just been won. And Clara, she was a founding member of a club there called the Blue Triangle Club, which was comprised of women who were employed. So in those days, of course, that meant that these women were not married, because if they had been married, they would no longer be working outside the home. And it was that group of women who became really strong friends of hers. And it was to those women that Clara was writing letters. And that's why the letters were at the YWCA, because they would read her letters aloud at their meetings.
For those who don't know what the YWCA, because let's face it, it doesn't have the wide knowledge today that it did back then. Can you
Mm-hmm.
explain to the listeners, what is the YWCA?
Well, what the YWCA was at that point is, it has evolved, it has changed a lot. But in those days, the YWCA, in those days, it stood for Young Women's Christian Association. It no longer is a Christian association, but it was then. It was first started the very first YWCA was formed in England. It had a presence throughout the world. Part of what I learned in researching for this book is what amazing things the YWCA was accomplishing throughout the world. There were employees of the YWCA of the USA who would go and collaboratively work with YWCAs in various parts of the world. And it was that network that Clara was able to access. And Clara herself actually had an impact internationally. She formed a club at the Shanghai YWCA. She was the founder and the first president of that club. She contributed as well as benefiting from presence of these organizations. And they really were, they really served women who were traveling. They served women, immigrant women. They were just, I mean, it was really a great place for her to, have a touchstone wherever it was that she went.
The more you learn about the YWCA back from the 1900s to like the 1950s, it's a phenomenal organization. It's so sad that we don't know about that today, and that I just don't feel that there is anything that comes close to doing the same thing today. What is your basic description of the book? Well, no, I'd say you probably have already given a basic description of the
Well,
book.
I'll tell you I'll just give you a couple of things that people have said about the book. One that I really love is somebody said that I was the story seamstress. So it is, I mean, it is clearly a story about Clara Pagel. And it is a collection of her letters. It's sort of a character study, but I I am the person who sort of brought together put the letters in context and sort of, added what I've learned about Clara leading up to her departure on this trip in 1936, and then what she made of the remainder of her life after 1939. Somebody described it as a dangerous book because it made her want to travel everywhere.
It does. Warning. Warning to anyone who reads it. It will make you want to travel
Yeah,
badly.
she was somebody described her personality as equal parts curiosity and joy with a nice dash of snark.
Yes. I
Yeah,
loved her
and I
snark.
yeah, and she would be. I mean, she would be just so fun to travel with, and in a way, that's what the experience is like. It's like she is taking us on this trip with her.
I loved how in the letters, like, she's telling all these amazing things and wild stuff that's happening, and then there's also just kind of benign, normal, and the things that make you think, "Okay, she's just human." Like, I remember, the boat trip when she was leaving Italy and going, she was trying to get to South America, and her problem with the seasickness. And I'm like, here
Uh-huh.
is this woman. She's this traveler. She's been to all these places. And she's like, oh, boats. And she's like, why do I get on these things? It's like the minute
Right.
she gets off the boat, she forgets about the seasickness. And then she gets on it and she's like, what was I thinking?
Well, and then, like she has some letters from China about how much she loves lingerie.
Oh, yeah. And I think also it makes sense. That is a personal luxury item, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because the only one who's going to see that is her.
Mm-hmm.
That is strictly for her to enjoy. And when she left at 40, she had to go without a lot of luxuries. Her mom was sick, her whole life was very structured and confined.
Yep.
And I think once she let loose, she's like, I'm going to buy what I like for me, and I don't have to worry about anyone else anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And she totally lived with that abandoned freedom. What were some life lessons or new perspectives or, I don't know, just interesting bits you learned from her letters?
It gave me a different perspective about World War II and the lead up to World War II. I always had such a U.S. centric, or even maybe European centric view about World War II. I had no clue about the Sino-Japanese War. The fact that she was right there in Italy when Ribbentrop came to negotiate the Pact of Steel, and she's describing the swastikas, and she's describing these put-up parades in Ribbentrop's honor. Ribbentrop was the Nazi foreign minister. I mean, she was almost like, Forrest Gump. We saw.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was probably the biggest value to me, is sort of opening my eyes to a different perspective. She encountered people she encountered some people from Austria who claimed that they were happy that Germany had taken them over.
That surprised me.
Yeah.
And then she found people who were like absolute opposite that are like, "You're crazy. What the heck are you talking about?
Yes.
This is the worst thing that's happened to our country." And
Well, and you did get a sense of the fear about saying what you really thought. And she did not want to put anybody in danger. She was really eager to have these conversations, but she was savvy enough to know that she had to sort of take some of what people said with a grain of salt. At one point, she said, I have to be careful when I put two and two together that I get four instead of 22.
yes. And it was interesting when she would talk about openly in many letters the censorship
Yeah.
that she had to deal with in different countries. And, you know, being in America, we just don't think about that level of censorship. There's a lot of people even today who live in countries that dictatorships and all of that exist. They don't have that kind of freedom, and they have to be careful about what they put in their mail. She got to experience a bit of this oppression of the weirdness of like, okay, I can do these things and this is free, but then there's also this eye watching you, and you you can't ever forget that you're not completely free here.
Yeah. Yeah. We've never had bombs from international bombs hitting our shores. And of course, she experienced bombing up close. Um, she experienced, and her description of that is really effective, I think. Think about, she went through the typhoon, injured her ankle. Then, shortly thereafter, she experienced bombing up close in Shanghai. Then she was on a ship being evacuated to Manila, and the bombs were falling right overhead. She got to Manila, and half an hour later, there was an earthquake in Manila. I mean, and she also went through a mugging when she was
Oh,
in
that's
Manila.
right.
Yeah.
Oh, her experiences were amazing. Different people she was meeting, like the locals, the different classes of people, the different kinds of people,
Mhm.
and it was very interesting. She spent time, and it's so again of what so many history books, and they don't talk about how people live, the
Mhm.
living history, which I always think is terribly interesting.
Mhm.
She gave not only political history and stories of geography, but also living history of how different people in different places lived
Mhm.
and how women were treated in different places.
Yes. Yes.
And that was there was just so much fascinating things to learn.
I just loved it. She had some expressions that she would use quite frequently, especially like after she just gone through some ordeal. She would say, "Oh, what a life!" Or she would say, "All things end, and so did this."
Yes. It's been an experience.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
She was such a forward-thinking person. You totally can tell her past was not a happy one.
Mhm.
Once she was leaving that behind, she was really leaving it behind, which I think so I wanna ask her how she did that.
Mhm.
How did she really let go of all that emotional baggage that she didn't take that with her.
Hmm. Yes, and there was a letter in this scrapbook that has just, come to my attention recently. There was a letter in there from somebody who I think she had worked with, and he made the comment about how he didn't know anybody who would get as much out of this trip as she would, because she really had the capacity to learn and to enjoy, and that this was something she was doing not for the purpose of having something to boast about, but because she really had this curiosity and this desire to learn. And it really is quite astonishing, I think, that she recognized the prejudices which she held. And part of her reason for undertaking this was to overcome those prejudices. She was aware that she had this anti Semitism. It made her very upset that she thought she was making progress, and then she sort of slipped back when she was spending some time on that Italian ship off the coast of Africa, and she was with a group of Jewish folks who were fleeing the war. And she felt herself slip back into some of that prejudice, and she felt horrible about that.
Do you have a passage from the book that you would like to read and share with the listeners?
Well, I think that listeners might enjoy hearing her description of the first time she was on an airplane. This was in China in December of 1936. Here it is. My first experience on a plane was anything but heartening. We got to Nanking and waited an hour for better weather. It was pouring. The plane was filled to capacity, no ventilation when the plane stands still. So I got outside and scooped under a wing for an hour or so in a field that was like a swamp. I got my feet soaked to the point where the water bubbled up between my toes when I tried to exercise them. And after I got cold to the point of extinction, I went back into the plane and tried to dry my feet by wrapping them up in the steamer rug provided by the steward. I had had breakfast about 6 that morning and had no more food. The plane was supposed to have arrived at Hankow at 10:55 a.m. We got there around 3 that afternoon. We stepped out into an icy blast, rain, and deep mud, and had to walk about half a block to the waiting bus and pack into it 2 deep. With an empty stomach and the plane, the last lap, feeling like a springless ox cart, wallowing from side to side and climbing and falling with sudden jerks, believe you me, I had all I could do to keep from a rendezvous with my breakfast. Anyway, I came into Hankow tired, hungry, somewhat nauseated, awfully wet, terribly cold. Outside of that, I was quite happy.
That is so her. Here's all these miserable things happening, but you know what? Overall, it's not bad. I'm having an adventure.
Yeah. And I think that as much as she would complain about those things, she knew that it was really the discomfort and the uncertainty that made travel a growth experience.
Yes.
So I think she relished these things that were happening that were difficult. Well, I have not had a chance, Jackie, to get to talk about my publisher, which I do not want to overlook. My book was published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, and it was a wonderfully collaborative process to do that, and they've been enormously supportive. But something that I think is really instructive for all authors is the support that I've received from independent bookstores. And in fact, it was the owner of an independent bookstore who first suggested to me that I contact the Wisconsin Historical Society Press.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm so glad that we got to do this. This has been a blast.
Well, thank you so much for your enthusiasm, and just keep crushing on my book whenever you'd like.
Oh, one last question. Are you working on
Uh-huh.
anything new?
Well, actually, I am thinking that I would like to write a historical fiction book with the main character being a fortune teller.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. I look forward to hearing more.
Right.
When you've got that one ready, contact me and we'll have you on
Oh,
again.
thank you, Jackie. I'll do that.
So, where can you get a copy? I got my letters from Clara by having a local bookstore order it for me. You can also find it online. It's around 200 pages, so it's a pretty quick read. After reading it, I was encouraged to be more mindful in my daily life and to take more chances, to say yes. Thank you, friends, for coming back to my second season. I am so happy to have you along for the journey. Next week, I begin a story series that is going to be a lot of fun. Then, in 2 weeks, I have a brilliant guest, and we're going to talk about perfectionism. Can't wait to hang out with you again. Until then, I wish you well.